Story 1. When I was crying to my mother about my stepbrother choking me to the point I was turning red and a bystander had to pull him off me, she just shrugged and asked if I had done something to him. I also told my father and he got angry at me. Definitely messed up, that's for sure. Story 2. Hearing from other children how generous their parents were. Taking them to a pediatrician, giving them basic advice, caring about their feelings, helping them when they were struggling. Then realizing all these things were not about going above and beyond but rather what normal parents do. Story 3. I realized my family was off when my mom encouraged my brother to join the street life. Not for financial reasons, but genuinely just so she could brag. I don't even know how it is something to brag about, but in some communities, that her son was out there running things. I only realized it was wrong because of the TV shows and movies I saw about family and friends trying to get the main character to leave the street life, not join it. Story 4. When I was told not to talk to my friends about certain things that happened at home because you do not share everything with non-family members, and they will not understand. Story 5. When I realized I did not want to bring my friends or future partners around them because I was afraid my family would be mean to them. Story 6. I went to a friend's house after school one day, and her mother called us down for dinner. I was astonished that the whole family sat down at the table, ate together, chatted, joked, and laughed. They actually seemed to be enjoying each other's company. There was no tension, no one was yelling or being sullen, and there was no hint of threat in the air. Just a simple, fun dinner. Apparently, they did that every night. Shocking behavior. I privately thought her family was really unusual for that, but once I started making more friends, I began to realize it was my family that was unusual. Story 7. Lots of abuse and neglect, living in filth with mice and roaches. If something broke, it was ignored. We had a broken window for years. It was ridiculous. My best friend's mom used to have me bring my laundry on Friday nights in a pillowcase, and she would wash it for me for the next week of school. I purposely had physical education as my last class so I could properly shower and wash my hair with actual shampoo, not dish soap. My secret family made sure I had everything I needed from ages 12 to 17. They even bought my menstrual supplies because my mom would buy the cheapest and cut them in half for me to use. I was the only girl. During health week at school, when hygiene kits were passed out, I took as many as I could. If my well-cared-for friends didn't want theirs, I took those too. I left home at 17 and never looked back. My dad was not as bad as my mom, yes, neglectful, but he went through alcoholism and worked a lot, so we were left at home with the abuser. I reconnected with him as an adult. They had divorced many years before, and he genuinely was a sweet man who changed his life and was very sorry. By age 14, I stopped eating anything from the house because everything was contaminated with roaches and grime. I was big into sports, as was my best friend, so her mom always had a salad or sandwich for me in the car, along with a juice and some fruit. I ate breakfast and lunch at school through the reduced lunch program that I had signed myself up for. This was in the 1980s. Some relatives later told me they called Child Protective Services a few times, but they only counted bedrooms and never spoke to me or my brother. Child Protective Services in the 1980s was ineffective. I am glad I was secretly adopted. Story 8. I entered public school at 13. I was bullied by kids who immediately noticed my lack of social skills. I was as polite and pleasant to them as I would be to anyone. A month later, after I had established my first ever friend group, they told me how unusual my inability to be bothered by bullies was, citing my extraordinary ability to remain unaffected by verbal abuse. Being taunted for my physical appearance was not unusual to me because that was how my parents spoke to me. That was when I realized my parents were different. It had never occurred to me that my parents were different because I had always known they did not like me, and that being laughed at and called names by them was just how they treated me. Apparently, it is very unsettling to bullies when you genuinely laugh off their comments or respond with an even worse description of your failings without any negative emotions. It made me feel very proud of myself for the things I knew I was good at and, in an odd way, gave me the confidence to be curious. My parents did not care about me or anything I did, so I had to seek out what was important to me and accept the influence of people I genuinely respected and admired. Story 9. I felt a weight lifted whenever I spent time with other families. Story 10. When I heard a classmate's mother tell my parents how much she adored me and how I lit up the room with my personality, and that she was glad I was friends with her daughter, I was surprised. I had never heard anyone in my family speak with that level of positivity and depth about anyone, including family. I was confused as to why I could leave an impact on a woman I interacted with briefly, but my parents could not even remember what grade I was in. Story 11. When I was in elementary school, I would go to a friend's house. Her parents and brothers were very kind to me. They never made fun of me or said hurtful things. Their father never screamed if they made a mistake and never slapped any of their children for asking a simple question. In general, whenever I visited her house, everyone was calm and kind. Story 12. The first afternoon I spent with my best friend and now partner's family, I was 6 years old. I fell and scraped my knee as 6-year-olds do. His dad rushed over and helped me up, telling me it would be okay and that we would go clean it up inside. I had never had an adult clean my cuts before. No one had ever taken care of me, not since I was old enough to feed, dress, and bathe myself. I realized then that my parents were supposed to take care of me. Story 13. When I realized that in most families, 90% of them being alcoholics is not normal. Story 14. When everyone else's homes smelled like laundry and food, my home smelled like alcohol and marijuana. Story 15. Seeing families hug each other. We are a family that does not touch. Story 16. Whenever my aunt accused her own daughter of sleeping with her husband, who is also her daughter's father, I am not sure what compelled her to think my cousin was sleeping with her own father, especially since she was just 16 years old at the time. However, I am happy I lost contact with that side of the family. Story 17. When I was about 7 or 8, I realized that other families spent time together on vacation. They would do activities together, and their children did not just spend time hanging out with staff or locked up in the hotel room. When I was a child and we went on vacation, it was clear that my parents were the ones on vacation. We just had the privilege of tagging along. Our job was to spend as much time away from them as possible and not need them for anything. Then I realized other families also spent time together when they were not on vacation. I never realized that other families went for walks, played together, or played sports outside of daily survival activities. I thought kids playing basketball with their dad only happened in movies. Story 18. I went to a few other people's houses and realized that most houses really do look like the ones on television. The furniture might be less expensive, or there might be a little clutter, similar to the shows Married with Children or Roseanne. But overall, these houses resemble television houses more than my own. Turns out most parents are not hoarders. Story 19. My mother bathed us and dressed us every weekend to visit my biological father's family. However, she always kept us close to her. If any of us needed to use the bathroom, she would take us all and wait outside. My mother never behaved this way when we visited her family. My biological father's brother had assaulted 2 of my cousins. My mother wanted to prevent the same thing from happening to us. Story 20. When my family arrived at my aunt's house, her family went from laughing and jovial to quiet and anxious. Story 21. When I was at my friend's house, they just grabbed snacks from their pantry. The one at my house was always locked, and we were not allowed to get anything out of it. Things would rot. Story 22. The day my mother insisted I go to the bank with her, I did not feel like going, but she would not take no for an answer. I was 18. I accidentally slammed my thumb in the car door. It was bleeding and the nail was coming off, so I got out to take care of it. She was so angry that I was not going. After all that, she burned rubber leaving. She showed no concern about me whatsoever, then or later on. I did not have my keys, so I was locked out. I had to walk a mile to the neighbors for help with my thumb. When I told them what happened, the look of horror on their faces told me none of that was normal. Story 23. My friend's mom did not start undressing and rolling around on the floor in front of the television when she did not get enough attention. That was odd to me. Story 24. When I traveled across the country and spent a few weeks with my partner's family during Christmas, I noticed something important. His brother forgot to bring the stuffing to Christmas dinner, and everyone reacted appropriately and in proportion to the situation. Nobody died, we just ate more potatoes. There was some gentle teasing toward his brother for forgetting the one item he was in charge of, but everything turned out just fine. It was an appropriate response to a small problem. In comparison, the preceding year at my family's Christmas, my uncle kicked my mother because they had a disagreement, though I don't even remember what it was about. There was obviously more to it than just this incident, but that's the moment where it really hit me. Then I spiraled badly. I tried to break up with him because I fully planned to kill myself once I arrived back home. I thought there was no coming back from this. My family and I were so completely wrong that I had no hope of being a functioning person, let alone part of a real family. What am I doing here? Why am I wasting everyone's time? It was a very dark moment, and nobody could figure out what was going on. But even though I seemed absolutely insane, everybody just carried on and continued trying to include me. 5 years later, we're still together, and I'm slightly less crazy. Story 25. My father had an extremely bad temper. One time, when I was 13 years old, he picked me and my friend up from school and was in a really bad mood. He started screaming at me for being too stupid to know something or other. I was used to it and remained silent. Later, when I was with my friend, he was in complete shock. I downplayed it and told him it was totally normal. He said, "No, it is not. I never forgot that." Story 26. After my grandmother passed away, I realized something that made my family unusual. On my father's side, we simply do not discuss death. There was no obituary, no funeral, no social media post. Just the legal matters, notifying family and friends, cremation or burial, and that was it. Zero fanfare. This is not the strangest thing, but it is not something any of us were specifically raised to do or believe. It started, as far as I can remember, with my great-grandmother and just continued. Everyone on that side is very anxious, not quite enough to be considered bipolar, but enough to notice and trace through the family lineage. Story 27. I was maybe 11, and my friend was supposed to spend the night at my house. I was a bit embarrassed because we could hear my family fighting, but I didn't consider it a bad fight since the walls weren't shaking and nothing was being thrown or broken. She told me that if I ever needed a safe place to stay, her mother would come get me and I could stay with them. I knew her mother wasn't the most stable person in the world, but she took care of me from ages 11 to 18 whenever I needed anything. I could probably call her now, even though it has been years since I last spoke to either of them, and she would still treat me like family. Story 28. I watched Full House as a kid. Every time the children got in trouble, the guardians would calmly talk to them and give some sort of punishment. I always thought, I wish my parents would be like that. All they did was scream at me until I cried if I did something wrong. It took me until my 30s to realize that Full House was completely fictional. Parents did not actually gently punish their children. Story 29. When I spent an afternoon at my friend's house when I was about 8, her dad asked us if we wanted to do something fun. He ended up teaching me how to play Monopoly and how to ride a bicycle. It was then that I realized spending quality time with children is something that normal parents do. In our house, my parents never did anything with us during their free time except go to the mall and eat out. Story 30. Probably around the time my stepmom put a lock on the outside of my door and would lock me in my room with a small bowl of snacks and a television that only had about 3 channels. Also, we went to SeaWorld, and they just left me in the car, although at least the windows were down. Story 31. My parents were and are hoarders, so the first time I went to someone else's house, I was confused why every flat surface was not covered in clutter. Story 32. I always knew something was wrong in my family. I finally found out that my father had a mistress in another town. But with 6 children to raise, my mother could not justify divorcing him. She only had a high school education. Story 33. Other kids wanted us to go to their house. They did not get yelled at in front of me. Their parents would come out of their room to say hi and would not call their child to the room to loudly tell them to hide the valuables. Story 34. Things were too perfect the first time I came over to my girlfriend's house. There was a pie cooling on the windowsill and a perfect dinner made by a well-dressed mother wearing makeup. It turned out my girlfriend's father was having an inappropriate relationship with the older sister, and my girlfriend was next in line once the sister got too old. This is not a joke. Story 35. This is likely the third story of child sexual abuse within the family. The previous two cases involving family friends were less shocking once the pattern was clear. When one of my uncles suggested that I find a different therapist to help me get closer to the family instead of farther away, after being abused by another uncle for years, I knew the situation was irreparable. Story 36. My parents are good people, but they don't have any friends. They are self-isolated in my opinion. They raised good children and instilled morals in us, but they are ghosts in the community. It is kind of strange to be social outcasts yet upstanding citizens. Story 37. Earliest memories of starting school and my mother always threatening me to never tell anyone what happens at home. Every school assignment that involved talking about family and home life I either did not do or lied about. It did not take me very long to realize how difficult my life was growing up. Story 38. Being sexually assaulted by my father when I was 4 years old. I told the teacher about it and then the police came to the school. Story 39. We grew up in the countryside, and the police knew our names and we knew theirs. Story 40. I think it was the first time I talked about what my house in California was like when I moved back to Florida as a preteen. It turns out living in a handmade shack of plywood and plastic tarps on a man-made jetty as part of a homeless colony in Northern California for a year is not a typical experience for families. Chopping up and burning your Christmas tree because it was the only firewood available on the jetty 4 days after Christmas, due to your parents abandoning their 7-year-old and 2 toddlers under 3 to help your dad's brother with cooking, is also not a universal experience. Your 5th grade class and teacher will not think it is a silly story and will have horrified looks on their faces. My parents did a lot of questionable things while using methamphetamine, including cooking methamphetamine. Story 41. Thanksgiving 1998. My first memory of my paternal grandmother is her telling me it's okay that my father abuses me because I chose to look like my mother to torment him. My mother divorced Mr. Hogg that summer. I was only 4, but even I knew it wasn't right. The following Easter, he kicked me out of the car because I refused to stop being sick and drove off. He was abusive daily, frankly, but those actions showed that he felt he was right to do it. They genuinely believed that I started it. Story 42. When I was at my best friend's house and her father was there, he came in to say hello. My best friend said something mildly cheeky to him, and I held my breath, tensing up, waiting for him to get upset. He just laughed and teased her back. I would have been about 7 years old. It was revelatory and helped me keep my sanity until I could afford to leave home. Story 43. My dad's post-traumatic stress disorder. His reaction to loud noises was completely unusual, and we did not understand it until later. Story 44. People in public would always assume my father was my grandfather and my mother was his daughter. My parents have a very large age difference. My mother was 21 when I was born and my father was 51. Story 45. When I started high school, I realized how abusive my parents were when I became a doormat. Story 46. Being fawned over by parents. Like over the age of 5, kids were very clear in my family. Nobody was allowed to say paschetti instead of spaghetti. It was not cute. It was a mispronunciation. Then I had kids and thought them saying things like that was adorable. I mean, they did learn the correct way to say spaghetti, so I was not too concerned about it. Story 47. Made some friends in college who came from happy, well-adjusted families. They enjoyed spending time with their parents, and I realized I never did. Story 48. Therapy introduced me to the concept of narcissism, and everything suddenly made much more sense. Story 49. My mom said my dad was dead when he wasn't. Yes, really. Imagine my shock when I ran into him at the doctor's office when I was 8 years old. And the doctor herself made sure to confirm who that was, to my mom's absolute fury. Story 50. The big, grown-up realization happened when my mother asked me and my siblings to lie about our identities and claim to be visiting cousins when Child Protective Services showed up. Then we fled the state. I was 9, definitely old enough to know that was crazy. Story 51. I was oblivious to my parents' relationship. Then, when I was 13, they started randomly making a big show of awkwardly and chastely kissing in the hallway where my brother and I could clearly see it. A year later, they were divorcing. I guess their therapist told them to try to maintain a sense of normalcy for us or to make public gestures to see if it helped, but obviously it did not. I just remember being a kid and wondering, why do my parents seem to like each other all of a sudden? They did not, but they tried to pretend they did. Story 52. My mother's entire world was her only son, and he was never punished for anything. He was constantly rewarded, so now that he is grown, he is miserable. Story 53. Realizing there was a strange contrast between my father owning a garage of 10 sports cars and an airplane, and flying by private jet when he wanted to go on a family holiday. However, my mother's debit card would regularly decline in line at the supermarket, and we had to put some items back. When I realized my mother owed my father money, and he charged her interest on her loans. They are still together. Now I recognize this as financial and emotional abuse. Story 54. This is probably the opposite of what you expect. My family actually loves each other a lot. I tell my mom and brother all the time, "Rest in peace, Dad. I miss the hell out of him." Even my sister-in-law. We always end phone conversations with "I love you" and similar expressions. This is in contrast to many of my friends. Their families are not affectionate at all. It's unusual to me, but mine seems unusual to them. I attribute it to my dad having to take care of his brother and sister a lot and vowing to be there for his kids, and my mom just being the youngest in the family. Story 55. My uncle and aunt are divorcing but planning to pretend to still be married because they did not want to tell my grandmother. I was in my 20s and my uncle and aunt were in their late 50s or early 60s. Story 56. My other friends' families like each other and get together without drama or fights. They are kind to each other and want to support one another. Alcohol is not a focus. Story 57. That Hunter S. Thompson was in my family's circle of friends. Sure, cool, but my father looked up to him and that did not turn out well. Story 58. Whenever I talk about my weekend plans or past weekends, people comment, "Oh, your family must be really close." Apparently, it is not normal to hang out with your siblings, nephews, nieces, and parents all weekend and attend their performances in sports. I am glad to be part of this because they are all great people. Story 59. I grew up with two narcissistic parents. As you can probably imagine, our family had more than its fair share of dysfunctional behavior. One prevalent dynamic was the fights between my parents. Typically, there was a ramp-up period before big fights. About a week before anything actually occurred, the house would be, it's hard to describe accurately, but quieter. It wasn't a calm quiet, though. It was quiet because one of my parents perceived a slight, real or imagined, from a family member, and the rest of the family was walking on eggshells. As time wore on, the intensity of the tension could be gauged by how quiet the house had become. Finally, all hell would break loose, and a battle would ensue. They could last days, even weeks. The whole neighborhood would know, and it was embarrassing to go outside because our neighbors would pretend like nothing was happening. Even as screaming could be heard or things crashing. It made it even more uncomfortable and awkward. Eventually, my parents would get out their anger and frustrations on each other, and they'd be looking for a way to reunite. It's trickier when both partners are narcissists, though, because neither could admit they were wrong. I was the scapegoat of the family and was an easy and convenient target for them to focus on. So they'd make up and reunite by attacking me, which would result in me being thrown out of the house. Being kicked out started when I was 12. I look at children that age today as an adult, and I cannot fathom how they could have thrown out someone so young and vulnerable to God knows what could have happened. At any rate, I was lucky in that I had some friends with amazing parents who would take me in for weeks or months at a time. It was when I was staying at one of my friends' homes that I noticed something so simple, but that became a thread which unraveled to a revelation for me. I remember coming home from school and his mother smiling at him when she saw him. It struck me as strange at first because I could not ever remember a time when I showed up after school or anything, for that matter, and my mother's reaction was to smile at me. I had been isolated a lot as a child, so it had taken me a while to recognize how different things were in my family compared to others. Although it would take many years before I found therapy and began to unravel how dysfunctional and abusive my upbringing was, it was ultimately that one simple realization, that my friend's mother smiled at him because she genuinely loved him, that allowed me to begin recognizing that my family was different from those of my friends. Story 60. At school in the bathroom, maybe in 4th grade, my elementary school best friend saw the welts and bruises on my legs from being hit with a belt. She immediately took me to the school office crying, called her mother, and told her. The office staff were kind to me for the first time ever. My best friend's mother came to the school, and I went home with them that day. Story 61. I had multiple moments like that, but the one I still think about the most is actually ironically menial. I'm 30. 7 years ago, I had already been in therapy for years to work through, among other things, the trauma my family's abuse has caused. I had already been through the realization that other parents don't beat their kids senseless. What broke me was my boyfriend's mother telling me that, of course, she had used lactose-free products and that obviously the dessert had no hazelnuts the second time she met me. Not once in all this time had it occurred to me that I am allowed to expect people not to feed me things that will literally put me in agony. This is especially striking considering my dad is a doctor and my mom is a nurse. Story 62. I probably never felt safe or seen, and my sister always seemed to get all the good attention. Story 63. I always knew my family was a disaster, but I did not realize how bad it was until I grew up, moved out, and learned about the real world. They were not just a disaster. They were a flaming train wreck speeding downhill with no brakes. Story 64. Always hearing negative talk about the family because we don't have many educated people. Some of them joined terrorist groups and engaged in destructive activities that ruined the family wealth. Being from the countryside and a third-world undeveloped nation, I have listened to this since I was 13. Now that I am 18, I have no self-respect or self-love. I feel self-loathing. I hate myself, my existence, and everything about me. I am ashamed to have been born in the first place. I am ashamed to carry their name because they always speak negatively and do not try to improve themselves. They do not hate themselves or suffer from depression like I do. I am the only one affected by this and other issues. I do not know if I deserve to live or be cared for. I just want to disappear. Story 65. When other people started commenting on how jumpy I would get, especially from loud noises, I still get spooked by my fiancé at least once a week, and he tries very hard not to accidentally sneak up on me. Story 66. Sitting and listening to other kids chatter while at school and hearing them play while I was at home doing chores. It sounded unreal to me. Like people actually go out and do things as a family? Kids get to do things besides work? Play games in their own room without fear of parental interference? Or play outside after supper? As I got older, the surprising thing was people who could communicate openly with their parents. I tried this because it was the relationship I wanted to have with my parents. I thought if I acted a certain way or said certain things, they would listen, be more sympathetic, and finally ease the pressure. But no matter what I tried, they were determined that the terms were non-negotiable. My life was to be difficult no matter what, their little slave forever, or at least until I turned 18. My parents divorced and I moved out. 2 years later, I moved back with my dad. Turned out my mom was the problem in both our lives. The second half of my life has been significantly better, but I wish I could just let go of the pain from my formative years. Story 67. In first grade, when everyone else's parents came to the end-of-day performances, my mom screamed at me and said they were too busy. I never told them about another school performance and only ever asked to be dropped off for after-school activities, games, or performances if I couldn't get a ride as I got older. Seeing other parents lovingly pack lunch and remember things my classmates needed for projects in school, sending them well prepared for the weather, made me feel different. I was very young when I started to distance myself. I was more mature than all my classmates. They just didn't understand how to be grown. In reality, I was horribly neglected. I stopped asking for the things I needed very early because I knew I would get screamed at and punished. I worked as a nanny in my 20s for several very loving families who cared and were invested in their children's day-to-day lives. This experience showed me even more how uninterested my parents were in me and how ashamed they should be for their neglect. Thank God for my older sister, who is 7 years older. She showed up at every single event she could for me until she moved away when I was in 5th grade. Story 68. My uncle was a little weird. The man definitely had a form of psychosis and experienced catatonia. Story 69. Hearing other people tell their parents they love them and vice versa. I do not think that my parents and I ever exchanged those words until I went to college. I love my family a lot, but we are very repressed. Story 70. Not off, but different. I remember being very surprised going over to friends' houses and seeing the kitchens stocked with junk foods and sodas. My parents would have rather burned the house down than fed us like that. Story 71. Third or fourth grade was when I started spending a lot of time at friends' houses. They all seemed to have very unique families. They did things together, laughed a lot, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I hope they got through their childhoods okay. Story 72. Realizing that other families do not all talk at once with constant interruption and interpersonal side jokes that everyone just understands from one word, which lead to side tangents and might circle back to the main point. I would honestly get annoyed at my boyfriend's family for not remembering things based on very little information, and I would also get bored at their calm family dinners where they took turns talking about their day. Yes, we all have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in my family, and since it is 5 women and 2 men, most of us were diagnosed later in life. Why do you ask? Story 73. Oh, easy. When you were sent to visit your family overseas one summer and you were shocked to see that the mixed-race family next door is polite and lets you play video games with their children, and your aunt does not tell you off for playing with someone who is not white. Story 74. When I told a funny story about the time my dad was getting ready to give me a belting, he was so furious he didn't keep a good grip on me. I dodged the blow, and he hit himself across the shins. That was at a party in university. I'll never forget how I finished the story with a chuckle, only to be met by a wall of horrified silence. Later, a friend took me aside and kindly informed me that it was neither funny nor normal for a father to routinely beat their child with a leather belt. Story 75. I think I generally got the idea over time that it was not normal for a daughter to come home to her mother reading a book naked on the couch, which my mother called airing it out, or that hand-holding or kissing family members into early teens was odd. No, there was absolutely no sexual abuse. Just a lot of openness about nudity and an extension of forms of affection that are more socially accepted when someone is still a toddler. Story 76. When my little brother appeared on the scene, I knew I had to step up because there were not enough adults in the house to care for 3 children. The middle child was going to have to put in work to fill the gaps. Story 77. When the parents of the children I babysat for were appalled by my very normal approach to handling bedtime. Story 78. When my friends told me about the help they received with things like homework and their parents always showing up to pick them up for school events and parent-teacher conferences, I thought it was normal for parents to forget about you because of how busy they are. As long as I wasn't causing trouble, they had no interest in us. They often went on vacations or date nights, leaving me from as young as 8 years old to take care of my sister. They refused to answer phone calls and told me I was being overly dramatic. I remember one night when my sister had a bad stomach ache. I tried to make her a hot water bottle and accidentally spilled boiling water over my hand. Of course, nobody answered the phone, so I went to my neighbor, who was shocked to see me alone trying to take care of my burn. Story 79. I went to work as an au pair after university. I was surprised that people have family dinners and talk about how their day went, and that children's answers were taken seriously, not mocked or dismissed. I was surprised when the kid's dad came out of his study to ask his children, "How are you?" I was surprised that parents actually take kids to activities their children like, not just those the parents prefer. I was surprised that you can have fun with your parents and enjoy being around them. You can dance, sing, run, and they won't make fun of you. I was surprised to learn about family movie nights, where parents actually watch kids' movies with their children instead of only turning on something they want to see. I was surprised when the dad did most of the cooking, not because the wife was absent, but because he genuinely liked cooking. He was affectionate towards his wife. I was so surprised when he randomly brought her flowers and when they cuddled on the couch. At first, they seemed unusual, but then I realized it was my own family who was not quite right. Story 80. It always felt off, but I knew it was a giant red flag when my dad married my brother's ex-girlfriend's mother shortly after my brother and she broke up. My dad did not care about how my brother felt, and it was made clear when I asked him directly. My dad even blamed the family drama afterward on my brother gossiping about her in the locker room. Story 81. My mom brought me to an evangelical church multimedia show, a play that simulated a school shooting. You then watch all the children go to hell after they die to ensure that I understood the gravity of hell and what not choosing Jesus as my savior meant for me. I was 9. I still have nightmares about it at age 31. Apparently other parents do not do that. Ha! Story 82. It did not take long for all the differences between my family and others' families to become apparent. When I found out my friends' aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins were often 30 to 90 minutes away from them, and visiting relatives was a frequent event. Meanwhile, both sides of my family are thousands of miles away, and I have met them fewer times than I have fingers. When I found out my friends' parents were approximately 20 years older than them, about one generation apart. Meanwhile, my parents were 40 years older than me, about 2 generations apart. It is also awkward to tell people that Papa and Nana are actually dad and mom. Biologically, for real. When I realized that almost all my friends lived within the city limits and had neighborhood kids to play with. In contrast, I lived out in the boondocks and had no children to play with, and no, I was not a farm kid. When I learned that many other people had parents who actually loved and supported them and showed, or at least feigned, interest in their passions, hobbies, and happiness. When I learned that most other teenagers were not deathly afraid of dating out of fear their parents might kick them out for it. I do not mean anxiety around sex and pregnancy. I mean, I was literally afraid that if I ever so much as held hands with someone, I would be thrown out on the street. Now, I know that these things happen to other people. There are people with long-distance families. There are people with parents much older than them. There are others who live in nowhere. Others with distant parents. Others with abusive parents. But when you do a show of hands, who has any of these, and you are not only the only one in your social group raising a hand for any of them but also the only one raising a hand for all of them, it stands to reason you have been born into one dysfunctional hell of an off family. Story 83. My college friends called their parents every week, some more often than that. I always dreaded talking to my mother. It wasn't until I started getting to know my ex-husband, and then after I met his mother, that I realized how dysfunctional my mother and my household were because of her. I remember being amazed that my friends could call their parents at any time about any problems and their parents would help them. Whereas if I had a problem, I knew I had to solve it myself, and if my mother found out about it, there would be no concern for my welfare, and I would face severe consequences for inconveniencing her. As an adult, I retained a relationship with my stepfather and slowly came to realize that he would have helped me, but I still would have faced punishment from my mother no matter what. I also realized as a young adult that my friends' parents knew and cared more about my life than my own mother did. Story 84. Having yardsticks broken on my body from the almost daily beatings by my physically, verbally, and emotionally abusive mother became distressing. It became evident when my 7th grade physical education coach reported the bruising on my body. Comments from the other boys in the locker room reinforced this feeling. Story 85. When I was 8, my mom let me go to my friend Maria's for sleepovers. Her mom would cook, and Maria said she never had to cook dinner for her family. We got to be silly and talk at Blockbuster and got candy for the movie we picked out. At her house, we could stay up late, and there were no consequences for sleeping in. I always thought her house was messy because her mom didn't make her clean. I realized eventually that normal kids don't have to cook, clean, and take care of siblings. That was actually the parents' job. Maria didn't really have chores. She took music lessons, was in sports, and we had Girl Scouts together, so she didn't have time to do all that, and her mom understood. At my house, the only way out of chores was getting a job, which I did starting at age 12. I got a summer job detasseling corn that I really loved. Story 86. My house is where every friend I had tried liquor, beer, weed, cigarettes, dip, cigars, swords, guns, restricted rated movies, and did all around bad things. My mom was never home, going out to party at the bar with her friends every night. When she was home, she was acting like an unhinged raving lunatic, running late for something she spent all day getting ready for. I was like a child. I grew up before she did. Most of those same friends had families that cooked and ate dinner together, did their homework, and were in bed at decent hours due to parental supervision. Story 87. I realized that early in life when my mother treated me poorly, but my older sister and younger brother could do no wrong. As the second child, my mother wanted a boy and voiced her disappointment multiple times. My two younger sisters were basically ignored. I was the only disappointing one who never received the medical care, mostly psychiatric, that I required. I always had to make do with hand-me-downs. If my older sister or brother wanted anything I had, it was taken away and given to them. I was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as a young child. When I was finally diagnosed again as an adult, many things suddenly made sense. Then my mother told me that I had been diagnosed as a child, but since I turned out fine, she thought she was doing the right thing by ignoring it. I could have done much better in school if I had received treatment. That being fine turned into complex post-traumatic stress disorder too. When she died a few years ago, the nightmares about her stopped completely. These days I still suffer from mental illness, but at least it is under control with medication, and I am doing a lot better in life as a result. Story 88. When my father and uncle took turns sleeping with my aunt and mother. When my step-grandfather told me stories about being with my own mother. When I looked at my cousins and realized that all of our parents had been involved with each other. Story 89. Growing up, I thought my grandfather was rich, like top 10% rich. He had 5 mansions during my childhood and lots of very expensive toys. He was very generous with gifts for the family. After my grandfather was arrested when I was in middle school, most of the family was surprised. We were even more surprised when about half a dozen intelligence agencies from 4 different countries started contacting family members, asking questions about my grandfather and the various trips, gifts, and so on that he had given to everyone over the years. It turns out he was a major white-collar criminal with ties to some very dangerous crime organizations. All those crazy stories he told everyone when we were little kids were actually true, which was even more terrifying than thinking he had just made them up. Suffice to say, he was not a good man, and in the end his financial dealings ruined a few of my aunts and uncles, although I do not know the specifics. Still, he was my grandfather and I loved the man. He never wronged me or my siblings, so we were the lucky few who only had good memories of him. It has been over 20 years since he went to prison, less than 5 since he passed away after early release due to medical problems, and family members still get random calls from his former acquaintances looking for money he owed them or intelligence agencies still harassing family members. One particularly zealous agent from a United States intelligence agency harassed my family members for years to the point that his own supervisors had to retire him before the family sued and went to the news about it all. The agent even showed up at my university graduation to question family, while my grandfather had been in prison for 9 years at that point. Story 90. When I had to get a couple of mandatory vaccinations the summer before college because I had never had a single vaccination due to anti-vaccine parents, I spent that entire summer getting 1 shot in each arm every week because I wanted to receive all of them. Story 91. When my brother and I told a childhood story, sometimes laughing about it, everyone around looked stunned and asked, "Are you okay?" It was surprising to realize that even the lighter side of my childhood is seen as traumatic to others. Story 92. Middle school friends confronted me about my parents being physically abusive toward me, citing it as the reason they did not want to come over to my house anymore. I argued that it was a normal thing and they were blowing it out of proportion. They told me none of their parents hit them. Story 93. My dad was aggressive, especially when he got drunk. Everywhere we went, he got into screaming matches and fights. He abused my mom. He drank every day and yelled at the friends I brought home. He beat me for looking at him the wrong way and for every other reason. He tied my dog's feet up and beat him with a stick while I watched. He would throw my sister on the ground and stomp on her head. He had no lasting friends or family other than us. Growing up was very difficult. Story 94. When I asked my middle school best friend why her mother did not like me, she said, "Oh, it is not you. It is your mother she hates." Story 95. When I found out that the other kids in my middle school class did not get whipped with a big heavy leather strap or made to wear hobbles, I was surprised. They also did not have to fist fight their older siblings almost daily. Story 96. Looking at children who were morbidly obese and thinking, I cannot imagine that nonstop hazing and abuse from that child's father over his weight. Then learning that other children's parents did not constantly berate and humiliate them over every detail of their appearance. Story 97. I think the odd thing for me is that I didn't grasp the full realization of how off my family was until I was an adult because I was just in it and it was the norm. I was probably shut down to cope while I was experiencing it. My parents divorced when I was 10. My dad was always strange, but after the divorce, he was clearly mentally ill and unhinged. He had undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome and other issues, such as verbally threatening to blow my mom's head off with a shotgun. The normal things. At 11 years old, I was teaching him how to do his own laundry. I don't recall my dad ever hugging me, and he didn't say, I love you, until I was in my 20s when he thought he was dying of cancer. My mom was dealing with her own pain, and I always thought she was the normal one, but as I've gotten older, I see how she's socially off, has some kind of neurodivergence, became a hoarder, and is emotionally unavailable. She didn't protect me from psychological abuse. I'm 55, and it just occurred to me this year how odd it is that when I tried to take my own life at 12, my parents didn't see it as a huge red flag that they were failing at parenting and that I needed help. Summary. What is wrong with parents? Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.